The bailiff rolled his eyes as the homeless man shuffled toward the defendant table, dragging a torn plastic bag behind him. Court clerk Jennifer Martinez whispered to the prosecutor about the stench, while other defendants in the gallery snickered at his matted hair and dirt-stained clothes. The man's torn jacket revealed a faded military patch barely clinging to the frayed fabric, which only made the public defender shake her head in annoyance. Robert Wilson kept his shoulders straight despite their mockery, moving with the deliberate pace of someone who had learned long ago that dignity came from within, not from what others thought. The prosecutor shuffled papers dismissively, already planning to push for maximum jail time on the vagrancy charges. This was just another homeless case clogging up the docket, another waste of taxpayer money on someone who clearly had given up on contributing to society. Wilson settled into the wooden chair at the defendant table, his weathered hands folding calmly in his lap, while the courtroom continued its chorus of whispered complaints and barely concealed disgust. The public defender assigned to his case hadn't even bothered to review his file properly, simply planning to plead him out and move on to more important matters. Judge Patricia Anderson entered the courtroom with military bearing that no one seemed to notice, her attention focused on the morning docket. She had seen hundreds of these cases, homeless veterans failed by a system that promised to care for them, but delivered only bureaucratic indifference and courtroom humiliation. The clerk began reading from the docket in her practiced monotone, announcing each case number and charge with bureaucratic efficiency. When she reached Wilson's case, her voice carried the same dismissive tone she used for all the homeless defendants who cycled through this courtroom weekly. The case of the people versus Robert James Wilson, charged with vagrancy and trespassing, she announced without looking up from her papers. Judge Anderson's pen stopped moving across her notepad. Her head lifted slowly, eyes focusing intently on the defendant table with sudden sharp attention. The name had struck something deep in her memory, something that made her pulse quicken with recognition that had nothing to do with legal proceedings. Robert James Wilson, she repeated quietly, her voice carrying a weight that made the entire courtroom fall silent. Wilson looked up and met her gaze directly, his weathered face showing the first hint of surprise since entering the courthouse. Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding that transcended the shabby surroundings and dismissive atmosphere that had defined his morning. The judge rose slowly from her bench, her movement deliberate and formal. Every person in the courtroom sensed the shift in atmosphere, the way the air seemed to change when something significant was about to happen. The prosecutor stopped shuffling papers. The bailiff straightened in his chair. Even the other defendants stopped their restless movements. Wilson remained seated, but his posture straightened slightly, recognizing the signs of military protocol even in this civilian setting. Judge Anderson's eyes never left his face as she processed what she was seeing, comparing the man before her with memories that stretched back decades. Judge Anderson's voice transformed completely when she spoke again, carrying a respect that made everyone in the courtroom lean forward to catch her words. "Mr. Wilson," she said with careful formality, "would you please stand?" The public defender looked confused, glancing between her client and the judge with growing bewilderment. This wasn't standard protocol for a simple vagrancy case. The prosecutor's confident expression began to fade as he realized something significant was unfolding beyond his understanding. Wilson rose from his chair with the measured movements of someone accustomed to military bearing, despite his current circumstances. The torn jacket couldn't hide the way he held himself, the ingrained posture that decades of civilian life hadn't completely erased. "Your Honor," Wilson replied, his voice steady and clear for the first time since entering the courthouse. The single phrase carried dignity that contrasted sharply with how everyone had been treating him moments before. Court personnel who had been whispering and snickering fell completely silent, sensing they had gravely misjudged the situation. The bailiff stopped his casual leaning against the wall, straightening as professional instincts kicked in. Jennifer Martinez, the court clerk, stared with growing realization that her dismissive attitude might have been a serious mistake. Judge Anderson studied Wilson's face carefully, comparing the weathered features before her with memories of a much younger man in uniform. The courtroom atmosphere had shifted from routine dismissal to something approaching reverence, though most people still didn't understand why. The prosecutor cleared his throat nervously, suddenly uncertain about the slam-dunk case he thought he was handling. "Mr. Wilson," Judge Anderson said carefully, "may I ask about your service record?" The question hung in the courtroom air like a revelation waiting to unfold, transforming what everyone assumed was a routine homeless case into something far more significant. Wilson nodded once, his response measured and respectful. "Vietnam, Your Honor. 1st Cavalry Division. 3 tours between 68 and 71. The judge's eyes widened slightly as pieces of a decades-old puzzle began falling into place. She had served as an Army nurse during that same period, had treated wounded soldiers from that exact division in field hospitals that seemed like another lifetime ago. Several older men in the courtroom gallery sat up straighter, their own military backgrounds suddenly relevant to the proceedings unfolding before them. One graying veteran in the back row leaned forward, studying Wilson's face with new recognition and growing respect. The court reporter's fingers slowed on her stenotype machine as she realized she was documenting something extraordinary rather than routine legal proceedings. This wasn't just another vagrancy case involving a homeless defendant who had given up on society. Judge Anderson's voice carried warmth that surprised everyone present when she continued her questions. "The 1st Cav saw heavy action during those years. You were there during some of the worst fighting of the entire war." Wilson's response was simple, but carried weight that filled the silent courtroom. "Yes, ma'am. We did our duty." The public defender stared at her client with dawning realization that she knew absolutely nothing about the man she had planned to rush through a guilty plea without proper representation or consideration. Judge Anderson's voice carried quiet reverence as she continued her inquiry, each question revealing more of Wilson's distinguished record. "The Bronze Star with V device," she said softly, recognizing the significance of combat decorations that most civilians never understood. Wilson nodded without elaboration, his humility making his service record even more impressive to those who understood military honors. "The Purple Heart as well, Your Honor. Wounded twice, but returned to my unit both times." The prosecutor sat frozen at his table, realizing that his routine vagrancy case had transformed into something approaching a military honors ceremony. The man he had planned to railroad into jail time had earned decorations for valor under fire, had bled for his country in ways that demanded respect rather than dismissal. Judge Anderson shared her own connection to that terrible period of history. "I serve at the 12th EVAC Hospital in Siu Chi. We treated so many brave soldiers from your division. Heroes who deserved better homecomings than they received." The elderly veteran in the back row stood up slowly, his own military bearing evident as he rendered a respectful nod toward Wilson. 2 other veterans in the gallery followed suit, creating an impromptu moment of recognition that transcended the legal proceedings entirely. Wilson's weathered face showed the first emotion he had displayed since entering the courthouse, a brief acknowledgement of brotherhood that connected him to others who understood the cost of service. The faded patch on his torn jacket suddenly seemed less like a remnant of forgotten glory and more like a badge of honor that had never lost its meaning. The bailiff cleared his throat uncomfortably, uncertain how to handle court proceedings that had evolved far beyond standard protocol. A young man in the gallery stood up suddenly, his voice shaking with desperation that cut through the courtroom's reverent atmosphere. "Your Honor, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I need help. I'm living in my car with my kids, and the VA keeps giving me the runaround about housing assistance." Judge Anderson looked at the interruption with concern rather than irritation, recognizing another veteran in crisis. Several other people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably, revealing their own struggles with homelessness and failed support systems that had brought them to this same courtroom. Wilson turned toward the young veteran, his experienced eyes immediately assessing the situation with the sharp focus of someone who had navigated both military service and street survival. The young man's uniform was clean, but his face showed the exhaustion of someone fighting battles on multiple fronts without adequate support. "This is exactly the problem we're seeing every day," Wilson said quietly to Judge Anderson. "The system is overwhelmed, and these young veterans are falling through cracks that shouldn't exist. They need advocates who understand both the military culture and civilian bureaucracy." The prosecutor realized his morning docket had evolved into something far more complex than simple vagrancy charges. Multiple veterans needed immediate intervention, and the traditional legal system seemed inadequate to address their interconnected problems. Judge Anderson studied Wilson with new understanding of his unique qualifications. His years on the streets had given him insights into system failures that desk-bound administrators never witnessed firsthand. His military background provided credibility with struggling veterans who had lost trust in official channels of support. The courtroom had become an informal crisis center where Wilson's dual expertise in military service and civilian survival suddenly seemed invaluable. Judge Anderson leaned forward with intense focus, addressing Wilson directly about the crisis unfolding in her courtroom. "Mr. Wilson, you clearly understand these issues from both perspectives. What would actually work to help veterans like this young man?" Wilson's response demonstrated knowledge that came from lived experience rather than bureaucratic theory. "The VA housing voucher program exists, but caseworkers don't understand military culture. These veterans need someone who speaks their language and knows how to navigate the system without getting lost in red tape." The prosecutor found himself taking notes instead of preparing for trial, recognizing that Wilson possessed expertise that could revolutionize how the court system handled veteran cases. This wasn't just about one homeless defendant anymore, but about systemic solutions to problems that affected hundreds of local veterans. "Mr. Wilson," Judge Anderson continued, "would you be willing to work with this court to develop a veteran intervention program? Your insights could prevent many of these cases from reaching trial in the first place." Wilson straightened slightly, sensing purpose that had been missing from his life for years. "Your Honor, I've been working unofficially with homeless veterans for the past decade. I know which shelters will take them, which programs actually deliver services, and how to cut through bureaucracy to get immediate help." The young veteran in the gallery stepped forward eagerly, hope replacing desperation in his voice. "You really think you can help me get housing for my family?" Wilson nodded with quiet confidence that impressed everyone present. "I can have you in temporary housing by tonight and start on permanent placement by next week. The resources exist, but you need someone who knows how to access them effectively." Wilson pulled a worn notebook from his jacket pocket, revealing detailed records he had been keeping of veteran resources and contact information throughout the city. His organizational skills impressed Judge Anderson as he flipped through pages of meticulously maintained data about shelter availability, case worker schedules, and program requirements. "Here's what we need to do immediately," Wilson said with the authoritative tone of someone accustomed to coordinating complex operations. "Veterans Emergency Services has 3 beds available today, but their intake process requires military DD 214 paperwork that most homeless veterans can't keep organized." The young veteran nodded eagerly as Wilson continued outlining a comprehensive action plan. "I maintain relationships with caseworkers at 5 different agencies. Sarah Martinez at the VA Housing Office will expedite applications if I personally vouch for the veteran situation and provide proper documentation support." Wilson's detailed knowledge amazed the court personnel who had dismissed him as just another homeless defendant. He knew specific program deadlines, understood bureaucratic shortcuts, and had cultivated professional relationships that enabled him to navigate systems that frustrated most people. The prosecutor watched Wilson coordinate multiple phone calls with practiced efficiency, speaking to agency contacts with the respect of someone who had earned credibility through consistent follow-through on his commitments. This wasn't theoretical knowledge, but operational expertise developed through years of successful interventions. Judge Anderson observed Wilson's transformation from dismissed defendant to respected coordinator with growing admiration. His current capabilities far exceeded anything suggested by his appearance, demonstrating that homelessness had not diminished his leadership abilities or professional competence. Within 30 minutes, Wilson had arranged temporary housing, scheduled intake appointments, and coordinated transportation for the desperate young veteran and his children. 3 more veterans suddenly stood up in the courtroom gallery, their voices overlapping as they described urgent situations that demanded immediate intervention. One faced eviction in 48 hours, another needed emergency medical care that the VA had delayed for months, and a third required immediate mental health crisis support after losing his job. The courtroom transformed into a crisis command center as Wilson assessed each situation with military precision. His years of street experience had taught him to rapidly prioritize multiple emergencies and coordinate resources under pressure that would overwhelm most social service professionals. Judge Anderson watched Wilson take charge of the chaotic situation with natural leadership that reminded her of battlefield commanders she had known in Vietnam. He assigned specific tasks to court personnel who found themselves volunteering to make phone calls and coordinate appointments. The bailiff, who had been dismissive hours earlier, now served as Wilson's communications coordinator, relaying information between agencies while Wilson developed comprehensive action plans for each veteran's crisis. The prosecutor abandoned his legal files entirely, focusing instead on documenting resources and contact information. Wilson's calm authority transformed panicked veterans into organized units working together toward solutions rather than competing for limited attention. He understood that successful intervention required treating symptoms while addressing underlying systemic failures that created recurring crises. The court clerk found herself scheduling follow-up appointments and tracking progress metrics as Wilson established sustainable support networks rather than temporary fixes. His approach combined immediate crisis response with long-term stability planning that impressed everyone with its thoroughness and practicality. Within 2 hours, Wilson had coordinated solutions for multiple life-threatening situations that had been overwhelming individual veterans for months. Judge Anderson made an unprecedented decision that would transform how the courthouse handled veteran cases permanently. Mr. Wilson, I'm appointing you as Special Veterans Court Liaison, effective immediately. This court will establish monthly sessions dedicated exclusively to veteran support services rather than traditional prosecution. Wilson's appointment created ripple effects throughout the legal system as other judges requested his consultation on their veteran cases. His unique combination of street credibility and military honor gave him access to struggling veterans who distrusted official channels while maintaining respect from administrators who controlled resources. The prosecutor, completely transformed from his earlier dismissive attitude, volunteered to restructure his approach to veteran cases entirely. Instead of seeking jail time, he now focused on connecting veterans with appropriate services before legal problems escalated to courtroom intervention. Wilson established systematic reforms that addressed root causes rather than symptoms of veteran homelessness. His program created partnerships between legal services, mental health providers, housing authorities, and veteran organizations that had previously worked in isolation from each other. Local news outlets began covering the revolutionary veteran court program that was producing measurable results within weeks of implementation. Wilson's story inspired other jurisdictions to adopt similar approaches, spreading his influence far beyond the courtroom where his transformation began. The homeless veterans who had been cycling through the legal system repeatedly now found comprehensive support that addressed their underlying challenges while preserving their dignity. Wilson's leadership created sustainable solutions that prevented future crises rather than simply responding to emergencies after they occurred. Court personnel who had mocked Wilson that morning now regarded him as an essential partner in delivering justice that actually served veteran needs. Judge Anderson formally dismissed all charges against Wilson with a declaration that transformed the courtroom into a celebration of service and redemption. The vagrancy charges that brought you here today are dismissed with prejudice and honor. This court recognizes your continued service to veterans in need. Wilson's program achieved remarkable success rates that attracted attention from state officials and veteran organizations nationwide. Within 6 months, veteran homelessness in the county dropped by 60%, while recidivism rates for veteran-related crimes fell to nearly zero through his intervention programs. The courthouse dedicated a permanent office space for Wilson's veteran advocacy program, complete with direct phone lines to essential services and a resource library that he had developed through years of street-level experience. His makeshift notebook had evolved into a comprehensive database that other jurisdictions requested permission to replicate. Veterans throughout the region began referring to Wilson as their champion, someone who understood their struggles while possessing the skills and connections necessary to create meaningful change in their lives. His reputation spread through informal networks that connected veterans across multiple states. The same court personnel who had dismissed Wilson that morning now sought his guidance on family members and friends struggling with veteran-related challenges. His transformation from defendant to respected authority became courthouse legend that inspired more compassionate treatment of all defendants. Wilson established training programs for legal professionals, teaching them to recognize veteran issues and respond with appropriate resources rather than punitive measures that exacerbated underlying problems. His influence reformed not just individual cases, but entire approaches to veteran justice. The torn military patch that had once symbolized forgotten service now represented ongoing dedication to helping others achieve the dignity and support he had fought to preserve. 5 years later, Wilson's veteran advocacy program had become the gold standard for veteran courts across the nation, with his methods taught in law schools and implemented in over 200 jurisdictions. The courthouse displayed his military decorations prominently in the Veteran Services Office, where his Bronze Star and Purple Heart inspired both veterans seeking help and legal professionals learning to serve them better. Judge Anderson retired knowing that her courtroom had launched a revolution in veteran justice that saved thousands of lives while restoring dignity to those who had served their country with honor. Wilson's transformation from homeless defendant to national advocate became required reading for judicial training programs nationwide. The young veteran whose desperate plea had catalyzed Wilson's appointment now served as his assistant director, helping other veterans navigate systems that had once seemed impossible to penetrate. Their success stories multiplied through personal networks that connected veterans across generations and conflicts. Wilson maintained his humble dignity despite receiving numerous awards and recognition for his groundbreaking work. He continued living simply, dedicating his resources to expanding veteran services rather than personal comfort, embodying the service-before-self principles that defined his military career. Every month, the veteran court sessions Wilson had established continued serving those who needed advocates who understood both sacrifice and survival. His legacy lived on through systematic changes that prevented veteran homelessness rather than simply responding to its consequences. The courthouse staff who had once dismissed Wilson now proudly shared his story with visitors, describing how a moment of recognition had revealed hidden heroism that transformed countless lives through dedication that never wavered. Have you ever witnessed a moment when someone's true character completely changed everything? Share your story of hidden heroes in the comments below.